Couple of years ago, JavaScript standard changed the way how we declare variables and how you use variables across the entire project. That called the let and const changed from the classic way of doing that with var, which is standard way of declaring variables. But today we're going to take a look why it actually changed and how it's affecting the existing code base, especially the libraries that already have been using the var variables, and probably that might be introducing the breaking changes that nobody wanted. That's why the JavaScript standard actually, without touching the existing var structure, it started to recommend a new way of doing, and instead of making a breaking change, they actually introduced a new way of doing, but without touching the previous functionality, because of course there is a ton of code that is already written in JavaScript, so nobody wants to break them out. So let's jump into code and understand why the exact change happened and why it's so important to use with the new standard way of doing with let and const. Here we have a basic JavaScript file which essentially contains nothing. We're going to test it with the node to see how the variable declaration depends on a standard way of doing and why the change actually happened. So first of all, let's start by declaring a variable named test, and we can say the test1, and this test1 actually going to be a standard variable string, and we are going to just log it. We're gonna make the log enumeration because we want at the end to distinguish which log actually printed what. And secondly, we're going to assign the test2 for this variable to see what changes, and we are going to log again, saying that let's log the same variable but with log2 and see what actually happens. So in a short sense, like you can see that my code editor is actually underlying the var keyword because that's the outdated format of doing. So it actually recommends me using the more standardized way as a new release is coming up for JavaScript standard, which is a let and const, instead of using a var variable. But when I'm going to run this in my terminal, I can see that it just prints what we were expecting. So first, we are essentially declaring the variable with the test value, logging it, assigning another value. So this actually works the same way if we make this as a let instead of var. So there is no change in that sense. But let's take a look another continuation of this sample, saying that if we want to have some, random if condition that essentially wraps everything inside the same context, we can the older way we can redeclare the same variable, mutating the higher up context there. So in this case, if we're redeclaring the test variable again and assigning it a string, which is test3, we're logging it, and then we try to log this fourth time, this test variable, which was redeclared in this if context, will actually change the global variable context, which is declared here. And if I'm gonna run this code, you can see that my fourth log here is actually printing the same as it was declared in the test3 example. This means that whenever you have a globally declared variable with a var, you can always redeclare that variable and actually change the value coming from the global. This, of course, coming from the old way of designing JavaScript scripts, where you will have multiple files attaching to the same context and mutating variables and global variables. The same concept was actually in PHP as well, but that's the old way of building. Nowadays, declaring clear context for each variable is very important, because let's say if we are declaring this instead of var to let and trying to redeclare this here again with let here, we will see that the global context is not actually touching. So essentially we are printing this value which we redeclared in this context, but it is not touching the global context. And log4, as you can see here, is our test2 value which we reassigned for this variable in the second time that we assign a variable value here. There is also important stuff here. If we declare this as a const, then we will see that we actually get the red underline, because essentially we can assign the const variable value only during declaration and not after declaration. So it has to be constant. And the JavaScript framework is actually makes sure that we can't do that during the runtime as well, because that's already baked in to the Node.js or like any V8 JavaScript runtime that you are writing code for. So that's pretty important to understand here. And the big reason why this var variable started to be replaced by let and const is because it actually breaks the programming pattern of writing the contextual code and not being able to rewrite the global context anytime you want, because sometimes when you ship a libraries, the library itself should not touch existing code base that you already have. That's the main concept there, why it got replaced there. So that's the short explanation on why the var variable keyword started to be changed to let and const, becoming more standardized way of writing code bases. And if you are doing coding in any other programming language, especially with the compiled versions, you will see that they have almost the same concepts, where you can assign value for the const only at declaration time, and also you can't redeclare on the same context the same variable, or it's not going to be replaced but with the higher context variable. So that's the whole concept of having the same programmatic pattern across multiple languages and focusing on productivity instead of fixing large code base bugs, which is also one of the big reasons why var keyword got replaced. So write in the comments if you have ever worked with the code base that contained var and you faced similar issues of rewriting the context global variables or not. That's it for today. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe.